Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our viewers in Belize, in Jamaica, across the entire Caribbean, and across the world. Welcome to the University Press launch of the book, Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize, From My Hand to Yours, by Dr. Vernon. We welcome our author, Dr. Vernon, our reviewers, Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles, and Mr. Senior Counsel Godfrey Smith. We want to thank the board and staff of the University Press for making this launch a reality. In particular, we acknowledge Professor Denzel Williams, Professor Igina, Professor Monteith, Dr. Rocha, Dr. Simon, Professor Walcott Hackshaw, Mrs. Andrea McNeish, Mrs. Davis Mattis, and Dr. Smith, our university registrar. In addition, we would like to thank the persons on the staff of the UA Press who have made this afternoon's program possible. In particular, we thank Mrs. Nadine Buckland, Ms. Karen Smith, Dr. Kim Robinson, Mrs. Parnell Burton, Mrs. Gardner, and of course, Ms. Ajanelle Solomon, our IT administrator. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So let's speak about this important addition to the literature on Caribbean politics and our understanding of ourselves. So in our Caribbean pride, in our effort to put our best foot forward, we speak of our record of governance in generally positive terms, eager always to project positively to the international community. Dr. Vernon notes that these favorable assessments are also externally acclaimed through, quote, findings of quantitative studies that attempt to correlate aspects of democracy with specific independent variables. Belize is no exception to these valid claims of a flourishing democracy. To maintain and strengthen our democratic institutions, practices, generally our democratic records, however, we must have some introspection on our challenges, weaknesses, and inefficiencies. Dr. Vernon does precisely this in Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize. Much like Brathwaite's understanding in the Caribbean poem for Walter Rodney, where he says, politics should be like understanding the floorboards of your house, swept clean each morning, built by hands that know the wind and tide and language from the loops within the ridges of your footprints to the rusty tinning fences in your yard. Dr. Vernon does this by interrogating the various manifestations of these informal relationships between patrons and clients in this piece, in this important work on political clientelism and democracy in Belize. Congratulations to Dr. Vernon on this important work. This afternoon, we're happy to have with us two reviewers who will help us understand and unpack some of what this new publication has to offer to our understanding of the Caribbean. So yes, we may continue to celebrate the good record of democratic governance that we have, but so we can peel back and understand too, where are some of the weaknesses, where are some of the issues that we can improve to strengthen this. Today we have with us a distinguished panel of Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles and Senior Counsel Godfrey Smith. I'll first invite Professor Barrow-Giles to start her review of this work. Professor Barrow-Giles is a professor of constitutional governance and politics at the UWI Cave Hill campus and a distinguished senior fellow in the Constitutional Studies program at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a former Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Deputy Dean of Outreach at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, and Head of Department. She has authored, co-authored, and co-edited numerous publications on governance in the Caribbean, including 5 books. She has participated in several election monitoring and expert groups in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, and was also a member of the CARICOM high-level team to Guyana for the recount of the 2020 vote, and served as team leader of the CARICOM Observer Mission for the recount of the Guyana 2020 vote. She also served on the St. Lucia Constitution Reform Commission from 2005 to 2011, and was appointed by Prime Minister Mia Mottley to serve as an advisor to Barbados's Republican Status Transition Advisory Committee in 2021. In June 2022, she was appointed Secretary to the Barbados Constitutional Reform Commission. For her public service, she was awarded the Principal's Award for Excellence in 2020, and in 2021, she was a recipient of the Vice Chancellor's Award of Excellence, also for public service. Professor Barrow-Giles, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. And to my fellow panelists, Dylan and Godfrey, it's a pleasure meeting you all today. And of course, the man of the hour, Dylan, I haven't seen you in some time. We have spoken, of course, by, through the internet, etc., but we haven't really met since London. It's my pleasure to be here, Lisa, and I hope, Dylan, I can do some justice to your book. I really believe I need to read it a second time and a third time and a fourth time, ready to do justice, but I'm going to do my best this evening. I would like to thank, of course, the organizers of this event for the invitation extended to me. And by extension, therefore, since these are the organizers, I want to thank UWI Press. I think Lisa has identified all the key personnel. Okay, so in relation to Dylan's book, I just want to start by, like Lisa, just giving a little backdrop to Caribbean politics. And so when I read Dylan's book, and I think it's a very timely publication, what that work does is illustrated for me the perennial problems associated with Caribbean democracies. Democracies which, as Lisa so well put, on surface appear to be very healthy, to be very robust, and of course, it does give the impression to the outside world that we are consolidated as genuine democracies. Certainly when we look at the Caribbean, we can see that it boasts of elections in which the losers legitimizes the elections themselves by the very fact that there is explicit as well as implied losers' consent in every electoral contest regionally, except for that which we experienced in Guyana in 2020. Yet there are serious underlying issues that lead many of us to, in fact, question the very quality of democracy everywhere, and that includes Belize in the region. So Belize is, in fact, no exception to the genuine concerns, not only as academics, but also as ordinary citizens, especially as we continue to experience the sort of civic withdrawal, the sort of anti-politics that we are seeing in the Caribbean in the last 20 or so years. Now we know that even when election day or poll day is deemed to be clean and elections are in fact heralded as free and fair, even where poll workers in the Caribbean, as well as voters, are free from intimidation, direct intimidation, and they do not confront or face any violence, we know that such elections do very little to advance the cause of democracy in a context of systemic challenges to the electoral framework, which unfortunately, the electoral framework does very little to ensure does not in fact exist. Now, recall recent developments in the region where the CCJ has had to weigh in on at least 2 elections or elections in 2 countries, and where we have seen the judicialization of elections, with the regional courts being drawn into areas that traditionally have been seen as the exclusive preserve of the political. One such case is in fact Dominica in relation to the treating and bribery, which across the region is in fact illegal under the legal framework for elections, but which are routinely in fact ignored across the region. Now, all of this, of course, will be compounded today by this present moment of crisis, produced in part by the coronavirus pandemic, which has exposed the limitations of our model of development even more acutely than a mere financial crisis. And therefore, as a consequence, rendering many even more poverty-stricken and perhaps creating even more fertile ground for the political elites to double down on the tendency towards clientelist-based politics, even in a challenging, reduced fiscal space. So I wanted to start my presentation. Note I haven't started. I wanted to start my presentation by actually congratulating Dylan on the publication of what I think is a very immensely important work on political culture in the Caribbean, and specifically political clientelism, which we understand has been the bedrock of politics in the region. But even as I congratulate Dylan, I will extend my apologies to him and to UE Press for perhaps not having as thorough a read of the work as is warranted, given the comprehensiveness of the work produced. Truth be told, the book requires, as I indicated before the start of this session, a second and perhaps a third reading to do justice to it. As Dylan rightly concludes in his acknowledgement, though the phenomena of clientelism is open, it is nonetheless predominantly marked by a tendency towards informal and secret transactions. It is this tendency and its nefarious, illegal characteristics which makes it a sensitive topic to explore, especially given the small size of Belize, and we're talking about population size, as indeed all of the Caribbean states. And notwithstanding its sensitivity, with what I think is breathtaking scope, Dylan has successfully managed to deal with the subject matter with all the rigor and objectivity that one in fact expects of an academic. So I want to say to Dylan that I greatly appreciate the substantive work done in this, that you have produced in this incredibly important piece of work, a work which in fact expands and re-articulates earlier work on the subject matter in Jamaica, and which in my view should be required reading for all politicians, not just in Belize, but across the Caribbean, and for all citizens, not just politicians, but all citizens. From my own standpoint, Dylan, I want to assure you that I will never again address the issue of patron clientelism without a reference to your work, and I shall be doing so this semester. Now, why is this such a critical piece of work? In a nutshell, while Belize and other Caribbean states have been recognized, as we indicated, as one of the most democratic zones globally, nonetheless, there are critical issues related to the way democracy has been consolidated in the region. And the way in which it has been consolidated literally begs a question as to the quality of such democracy, and does democracy actually exist? Dylan's publication goes, I think, to the heart of this, and as indicated, builds upon the original work done by Carl Stone and Colin Edie on clientelism in Jamaica, as well as that of Amanda Saves on Jamaica as well. So outside of Jamaica, there has been no systemic study. There have been little things written here and there, but no systemic study conducted on the structure and the process of clientelism in the region. In that context, Dylan's work offers a vigorous contribution to the study and understanding of this phenomenon. So political clientelism and democracy in Belize, from my hands to yours, is more than just an analysis of clientelism in Belize. It is an assessment of the contours of political development in the country and as such can literally stand on its own in that context. Before I look a little more critically on what is on offer in the work, I would also like to make the point that Dillon's publication is really an exciting read. And it's exciting not because it can in any way be described as polemical or contentious. Usually when something is contentious, it becomes very, exciting. It is exciting, and I want to make that point because there is a view that many academic works are often dull, unexciting, even while recognizing that the work is in fact important. But from the outset, as you move through the book, whether it's from my perspective, whether it stems from the nature of the subject matter or the style of writing, or perhaps just my fascination with the mutual relationship between client and patron in the region, that book, From My Hand to Yours, The Shortcut, never in fact disappointed. So this is a very compendious book produced by Dillon. And it is intended as a study in political clientelism in a small developing multicultural society, attempting rather brilliantly, if I may say so, to unearth and explain the origins and development of political clientelism in Belize from the first universal adult suffrage elections in 1954 to 2013. That is a period of study for his doctoral work. But the book goes beyond that because it also offers the reader both a comparative assessment of the phenomena elsewhere in the region, as well as offering the reader a very compact study of the post-2013 period and the implication of clientelism for democratic governance in the country. In Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize, From My Hand to Yours, Dillon fills the literature gap on clientelist politics in the Caribbean generally, and in Belize specifically, by examining how clientelist exchanges are organized in practice and the consequences for the quality of democracy in the country. He starts off the work rather provocatively, I think. He provocatively teased the reader in his acknowledgement with a rendition of the culpability and willingness of the electorate to engage in clientelist politics and the implied transactional nature of such, as well as the abuses of governments and the potential misuse of foreign donations on the eve of a general elections. He also focuses extensively on the largesse that incumbents can disburse during elections. Now, these observations immediately raise for the reader the prospect of inequality of the political process. Dillon's basic premise is that there is something not quite right politically in Belize, which is successfully linked to the perpetuation of clientelism. So importantly, his work focuses on the use of public resources by politicians and the insidious connections between public policy, incumbency abuses, political mobilization, and elections, thus underscoring the importance of assessing the integrity of the electoral environment in the country, and by extension, the rest of the Commonwealth Caribbean. But it is not the opportunity for electoral benefit and its corollary electoral corruption, but larger, more institutionalized corruption and the resistance of the state to reform through the strengthening of the national integrity system that are also central to the work produced by Dillon. In other words, what are the legitimate prospects for change with so many groups and individuals benefiting from clientelist existence, even if it is to the detriment of the socio-economic and political development of the country? And these issues must continue to occupy the technocratic and political elites as the Caribbean states search for modernization. In his work, Dillon sought to answer 4 critical questions, and he tried to do that throughout the book. What conditions give rise to clientelist politics? This is the first major question. Why this particular mode of consolidation in Belize, and by extension elsewhere in the Caribbean? And thirdly, how precisely does clientelism affect political competition? And finally, what accounts for its resilience? While the answers to these questions, important questions, are weaved throughout the pages of the book, I think Dillon quite succinctly provides the broad answers to, or the broad answer to 3 of these questions in the opening pages of the book, with the following chapters tracing in detail the critical forces that sustain its dominance. Having undertaken a painful exploration of the literature on newer and yes, older democracies, Dillon quickly identifies what the literature sees as the three supporting conditions for political clientelism, namely the existence of poverty and inequality, which makes clientelism an attractive strategy for both patrons and clients. Secondly, the level of institutional control by political bosses with the implied lack of effective accountability and checks and balances. And the third driver, according to Dillon, is in fact the existence of comparative party politics, which counterintuitively would suggest that clientelist politics would diminish in one party or hegemonic party states, counterintuitively. If it is comparative politics that does so, then the opposite should in fact take place. But we know that is in fact not the case. That in itself is not well supported in the literature. Interestingly, while identity politics have often been downplayed in the study of clientelism, Dillon also attributes relations of gender to the development of clientelist relationships, which he contends with supporting evidence from the literature are fueled by gender, given women's predominantly non-presence in the corridors of power, and the fact that in the Caribbean, women are primarily clustered in the informal, low-paid sectors of the formal economy and consequently poor. And it is the poor, he suggests, mainly are the beneficiaries of clientelism. Not only, but primarily. Poverty and inequality, we are told, are critical drivers of clientelism in the Caribbean. For Caribbean states, the size itself, and in this case, not geographic, but population and economic, also contribute to the significance of clientelism in the body politics of every single Caribbean states. Employing what I believe is an innovative method of analysis, Dillon, by combining extensive ethnographic research with quantitative methods, he offers a compelling and really systematic analysis of clientelist politics in Belize, spending in the process what I think is really an extraordinary number of man hours on his fieldwork, which included a search of primary documents and extensive interviews with key stakeholders from November 2010 to April 2011. In the process, Dillon interviewed no less than 69 elites, several of whom were key players in the political and administrative sectors, thereby enabling him to draw conclusions from the wealth of information he would have been able to glean from these interviews. Now, beyond the introduction and conclusion, Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize is divided into six chapters, each chapter focusing on a very specific historical stage of development in Belize. It begins with the pre-independence period with a focus on what he variously described as helping the people. Here it traces the nascent development of political clientelism as the British authorities made do with handouts as a substitute for development, and the subsequent rise of competitive party politics, consequence of the fracturing of the People's United Party, ushering in a period of naked ambition and thirst for power, and with it, the increasing attraction of clientelism as a tool to effect political control. Now, chapter 3 expands a discussion of the post-colonial state, and then critically analyzes the immediate post-independence period, locating the lack of divergent development in the persistence of clientelist politics, whose foundation or which foundation had been laid by both the imperial and the immediate post-independence political elites. Here, Dillon asserts that the timing of independence of Belize in the context of global economic recessions and the rise of global neoliberalism had important implications for the development of clientelism in Belize. When combined with national decisions taken by political elites, some forced by the necessity of having to deal with international organizations, which both shape and are shaped by neoliberalism. Neoliberalism relentlessly led to the cementing of clientelist politics in the country. It is not that the political elites were merely hapless ploys of the international organizations. Dillon makes that clear in the work. They too were willing conspirators, enjoying power and making do with handouts to the people as a means of retaining power, for instance, through the institutionalization of the weekly political clinics in Belize. And I found his exploration of the weekly political clinics quite fascinating. These rights were first utilized by the PUP and then perfected by the United Democratic Party during which various demands were often made by the constituents to politicians, and the resultant sometimes yes reluctantly so as painted by Dillon, capitulation of political leaders, the patron to the client, the voters. This chapter, perhaps more than any other, masterly captures the symbiotic relationship between patron and client. And I thought that was in fact well done. In chapter 4, Dillon traces what he labels as the, and I quote, rampant expansion and deep entrenchment of clientelism, on end of quote, of clientelism in the body politics of Belize in the post-1990 period, asserting that by then Belize had moved from the innocent phase of clientelism to an emboldened leadership now bent on a new normal of guiltless and shameless trading. That's his words. So quote, a new normal of guiltless and shameless trading of political favors for political support, end of quote. And in that he's actually quoting Belizean Anne-Marie Williams. In chapter 5, Dillon speaks to the issue of the fueling of clientelism, identifying the process what he regards as a perfect storm, namely the entrenchment of, quote, tribally comparative party politics, higher rates of public corruption, the total absence of laws to regulate campaign finance, weakened public service institutions, increasing centralization of government institutions, and vote buying, all converging and coalescing to produce a type of politics that increasingly eliminates or erodes the ideological and philosophical distinction among political elites and parties, rendering it virtually impossible to utilize anything else but clientelism to appeal to the voters. This is Westminster Belizean style, or as Dillon puts it, Westminster Belizeanized, very dramatized with the unfortunate developments within the election management body of Belize, an institution of the national integrity system, which ought to enjoy a degree of both vertical and horizontal separation from the political executive, to insulate that body from political interference, and to give the appearance of independence and integrity of the electoral process. Even this body, Dillon charges, has been a casualty of the inexorable march towards clientelist-based politics. Take the money is the theme of chapter 6, in which Dillon successfully brings together the previous discussions on the development of clientelism and links it with the quality of democracy and the potential for development. He concludes that minimally clientelism has contributed to the blemishing of democracy in the country, which is not just simply limited to the impact on election outcomes. In a sense, therefore, stolen elections, but also to the co-opting of government institutions, leading to a form of crony democracy. It is Carnegie Endowment scholar Thomas Caruthers who made the case for a political gray zone in which states may possess some attributes of democratic political life, including the existence of opposition parties, an independent civil society, regular elections, and democratic constitutions, all of which are hallmarks of democratic states. Yet such states also experience serious democratic deficits. These include, but are not limited to, inadequate representation of citizens' interests, low levels of political participation beyond voting, frequent abuse of the law by government officials, low levels of public confidence in state institutions, and low levels of public sector performance. These and more, I think, Dillon has successfully demonstrated throughout his work, and is surely a call for rethinking of the Belizean polity. I know I have taken more than the time that was allotted, so I will conclude by saying that Dillon generally takes a rather jaded, I thought it was a rather jaded and very unsympathetic approach to patron clientelism in Belize. I think it's necessary. Very unsympathetic approach to patron clientelism in Belize. His focus on the impact of such on the political development of Belize and its governance, his assessment of the role of the willing conspirators, both patron and clients, makes the work, as far as I'm concerned, a very welcomed and much needed addition to the contemporary literature on the Caribbean generally, and Belize in particular. And for me, it is worth the read, it is worth the investment. For me, it is clearly a one-stop book on Belize political history that covers key historical moments from the immediate pre-independence period to the contemporary. The 8 chapters in the book and the appendix are not only excellently written with objective, incisive, yet passionate. There's something you can't avoid. It is very passionately written, and still maintaining that objectivity, which is so critical. It is objective, incisive, but passionate. And I say passionate, as I indicated a while ago, because the book showcases an individual who clearly cares deeply about Belize's past and future possibilities and shows a concern with all that can stymie the country's potential. So therefore, to conclude, Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize is extremely persuasive, intellectually stimulating, and I would simply end by congratulating once again the author and all those who contributed to its success, as well as to the foresight of UWI Press in bringing it to a wider public. I thank you, and I apologize for taking more time than was allotted to me.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. It was well worth every word you spoke. Thank you for giving such a good synopsis of work that is comprehensive, passionate, yet objective. Those who know me well tease me about depending on symmetry and balance, and I think you have captured this so well about Dr. Vernon's work. I'd like to welcome our online viewers, some of them UWI Mono master's students in the Department of Government. I know for one, your countryman, Dylan Rolanda Caballero from Belize is on. I'd also like to welcome Ambassador Curtis Ward, former Jamaican ambassador to UN, did such important work for our country on the Security Council, and all the other lecturers and students who have joined us this afternoon. Now, next, I am happy to get another perspective on Dylan's work from Senior Counsel Godfrey Smith. Godfrey is Senior Partner at the Marine Parade Chambers in Belize and the author of several biographical books on Caribbean leaders. He has served as a member of Parliament and as a Minister of Government in Belize. Perhaps he will be giving us some inside scoop. We don't know, but you have to remain with us to hear. He has also, Mr. Smith has also served as a High Court judge in the Eastern Caribbean. Welcome, Godfrey. We look forward to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction, and good afternoon from Belize to all who have joined us on the launch of Dylan's book, Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize, From My Hands to Yours. So, I have been directly involved in electoral politics in Belize for about 30 years. I have been a parliamentarian for 10 years, and I have been a practitioner of the art called political clientelism. Some would say the dark art of political clientelism. And some may even say that I have been an exemplar of that art. So, coming with that experience, what are my impressions of Dylan's book? Is it worth the read? Is it worth the buy? And does it add anything to our knowledge of politics, not only in Belize, but region? And I think the answer to that has to be a resounding yes. Now, I've known, or I'm familiar with the things described in the book, but what Dylan has so deftly done is to bring it all together in a penetratingly analytical way that makes even me a past practitioner. I'm retired from politics, by the way, since as a standing for office, retired since, or was retired, since 2008 and completely away since 2015. But still, what it did for me was to cause me to once again sit up and reflect on the ramifications, the implications of one's actions as a politician, what it means for democracy. So, in short, what is this book about? I think it is a illuminating and compelling excursion into what we might call the underside of politics, the underbelly of politics, the dark side of politics, the back room that a lot of people don't see. So I joined with my colleague, Dr. Giles, when she says, yes, you know, and with Lisa in her introduction, when they both say, democracy in our region is celebrated and touted because they're supposedly free and fair. There are peaceful transitions, very little violence when you compare it to other regions. And so that is celebrated, touted, and put up as a model for emulation. And perhaps there's nothing wrong with that. But what has been neglected for so long until Dr. Dylan Vernon's production is, as I said, what goes on in the back room. I think he refers to it at some points as the messiness attendant to the democratic process. And he does it so well. Had I not known that Dylan has never been a politician and never directly involved, so far as I'm aware, in electoral politics, I would have said, man, this man is a politician, because the way he reveals the vote trading, the clientelism, is so accurate, so detailed, so descriptive, that for that he must absolutely be commended. And I think when Dr. Giles talks about it being not the typical dry academic work and a very interesting read, I think she must be referring to some of those extensive descriptions and characterizations which came about due to the hard work. And I think I have to say, Dylan's reputation in Belize for being an independent thinker, an objective analyst. And so he had access. It's clear that sitting politicians and past politicians to open their doors for him. And he was able to take away from that and to put together for our benefit, and not only in Belize. I insist that I'm sure I'm not exposed directly to politics in the rest of the region, but I am sure that many, in fact, I know because I used to compare notes when I sat with colleagues, politicians from Jamaica and other countries, wondering if all the things I had to find money to finance was similar to them. I was shocked, this is many years ago now, to learn in Jamaica and other places that they had to service the very same things, from christenings to weddings to graduations to funerals. The list goes on. And Dylan, as I said, very deftly, very painstakingly sets it all out in a very, very readable way. But it goes further than just these descriptions. What he has done is to demonstrate how this thing might start innocently, as I think he quite accurately pinpoints in relation to Belize, to the father of the nation, George Price, who is viewed in many quarters as a saint beyond reproach and so on. Price did in fact begin this, and perhaps he was not alone. I suspect it was quite typical across the Caribbean in the pre-independence days. Small societies, almost like villages, and you can't get away with an aloof approach. So he was very paternalistic. You know, the Messiah type politician that we see emerged with Errol Barrow in Barbados, and also in Trinidad with Dr. Eric Williams, and a number of others. So very paternalistic, the one-on-one common touch, which naturally leads to, given that level of accessibility, the clients or the voters asking for little things. Now, I know Price, I've written about him, and I know that he never really went beyond $1 here or $2 there, and mainly giving out the party's newspaper, Belize Times. I mean, nobody wants that, of course. They want something more than that. But after a while, people would stop asking him because they knew there was nothing to be gotten. On that note, I want to segue a bit into this point about, well, how does one try to fight or change this attitude? In all my years in politics, Dylan identifies that there are basically two clinics, or at least for the leader. There's the usual Wednesday clinic where you sit in your constituency office and service the needs of your constituents. The lines could run from 70 to 100 people, and you try to see them all. But also on Mondays in the capital at the Prime Minister's office, there would be hordes, throngs of people sitting outside on Mondays. Tuesdays are typically cabinet days, waiting to get to see it and make some complaint. How shocked I was when this year I had not been to the Prime Minister's office in perhaps 15 years. I went back to see the current Prime Minister simply to see what changes had been. How shocked I was when I discovered that there was not a single soul there. Credit for that must go to the previous Prime Minister. The current one is Prime Minister Vernon. The previous one was Dean Barrow, who apparently stopped that business of having people throng outside his office on Mondays. And I asked the current Prime Minister, well, it was a shock to me to see such a massive change. And he himself said, well, I have to give credit to the former Prime Minister who cut that out. What is the relevance of that? Simply to say, I think as difficult as it is, behavior can change. But politicians have to want to change behavior. This doesn't go to the heart of the problem Dylan has identified, of course. But I raise it simply to say that behavior, politicians can help to cut back behavior and so on. So I think I won't repeat, I'll try not to repeat what Dr. Barrow Giles very ably set out in terms of the structure and evolution, but the book is a good read. It's a good read for students. It's a good read for politicians. It's a good read, important read for policymakers, for civil society organizations, because even they are not spared in Mr. Vernon's work, because he points out that, look, the clientelism becomes so pervasive that it's not just between political actors and their constituents, the clients, but it also goes into civil society, where very often a number of NGOs are dependent for subsidy for their very survival from governments, and therefore the task, their raison d'etre, becomes marginalized, kicked to the side, because they're dependent and are afraid to speak out. The same may also be true for the fourth estate, the critical media houses, who should act as a check and balance, are highly dependent on governments for advertising work. In fact, just on looking at TV this morning, one Channel 7 reporter was upset or complaining about the fact that a particular minister had pinpointed his news agency to withhold ads from, because supposedly for past criticism and so on. So this thing of political clientelism, vote buying, welfare state is so all-pervasive. Indeed, it will require a great deal of work. I think I don't want to go on at great length. Dylan makes the important distinction between, because the clientelism is of two fundamental forms: the vote buying that goes on at election and the semi-welfare state where all year long, and I can attest to this, for as long as you're in politics, you have to service the needs like of your constituency like a good patron, and all that comes out in the work. The impact of that is, of course, can be stated quite simply. Instead of ministers and politicians focusing on policies that will penetrate the root causes of the problems that we face in our societies, an inordinate amount of their time and energy is just spent servicing the needs, and that creates an unbreakable cycle. Because in my own experience, oftentimes when you try to offer educational opportunities, and I'm speaking from my own experience to voters, and say, "Ma'am, you can't come to me for a job because you have no skill. Here, I'm going to help you to get a skill at the Vortex." They don't want it; they just want the handout. So it's a grim outlook. I think education is key. There are some constituencies where the more educated the electorate, the less you find the incidence of this. And that may perhaps be the key. If there is one, perhaps, hopeful note, is that notwithstanding the entrenchment of this, as Dylan has accurately and analytically outlined, notwithstanding the entrenchment of clientelism, there is hope. Because you might think you're buying out these voters, but they've become so cynical. I mean, I've been involved in elections where an obscene amount of money has been spent, but the results go the next way, the next direction, simply because they perceive that you're doing the wrong thing and you can't buy the vote. So there is that element there that sometimes you just don't know how the electorate, but there is an inbuilt instinct about them where you ask yourself, well, how could the wipeout have been so thorough from north, south, east, west? There is an instinct in people. They understand it, they have their own internal compass and barometer, and hopefully we can develop that. Sorry for going on at such length, Lisa. The book is highly readable, very engaging, very analytical. It's a must buy for everybody who is interested in any kind of politics in the Commonwealth Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Godfrey, for your practical insights and analysis of Dylan's work. You spoke about the entrenched dark side of politics and the back rooms. You posed a question or made a suggestion that things can change and that the crowds aren't there anymore. I hope Dylan, in your response, you will let us know, is that really the case, or has clientelism become more sophisticated and therefore not so physically detectable in the ways that we have grown accustomed to seeing it manifest in our politics? I am hopeful as you are. I appreciate your prescriptive elements, Godfrey, in saying that the solutions are possibly education. Ironically, that voter apathy and cynicism may be the answer or the solution, in that voters now have self-pride and may be rejecting political clientelism and demanding more from our politicians. So thank you so much for your practical insights to this important work. I would now really welcome our author's response. I will take some time to introduce you properly now, Dylan. So Dylan Vernon has worked in international development for over 30 years. I keep looking a little closer when both of you reference these 30 years, however. He was ambassador of Belize to the European Union, to the World Trade Organization, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, and 7 European states from 2013 to 2020. Before diplomacy, his career in the development sector spanned directing the Society for the Promotion of Education and Research, chairing the Association of National Development Agencies, managing the Belize UNDP office, founding the Catalyst Institute for Public Policy, and serving on boards of several regional civil society networks in the Caribbean and Central America. Dylan has lectured in political science, and we hold you to a guest lecture for Mona, and Belizean history at several tertiary level institutions over the year. As a development worker or consultant, Dylan has influenced the formulation of social policies and designed and managed numerous development projects. He's a longtime governance reform advocate who led the civil society political reform campaign in the 1990s and who chaired Belize's first political reform commission in 1999 to 2000 and wrote the commission's report. Dylan holds a PhD in Caribbean and Latin American politics from the University College of London and a Master's of Arts in International Affairs from Carleton University in Canada. He has authored several published pieces, and is currently the managing director of DGov Consulting Limited in Belize City. While he has published several works, this book, Political Clientelism in Belize, From My Hand to Yours, is his first, and we have been really excited to hear about it. Over to you, Dylan. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you for agreeing to chair my book launch and doing so ably. Good afternoon to all of those who have tuned in. I appreciate you taking the time to be part of this introduction of my book. Cynthia and Godfrey, thanks for sharing your impressions and review of my book. I think that my job after those 2 reviews will be much easier, in that perhaps I can focus more on some of the key messages I think that I, as the author, want to leave, and perhaps then a bit on this big question as to what to do, ever being the advocate of what can we do to make things better. But before going into that, let me also use the time to thank UWI Press for and the team at UWI Press for agreeing to publish my book. The support you gave over the process, the arduous process of doing this, justified my choice in selecting UWI Press as my publisher. No, as I said, and I think Cynthia's a very detailed and chronological look at the book relieves me from having to do any of that, and Godfrey's focusing on the issues of the more practical sort of manifestations from his experience, and also a bit on the question of what to do, also gives me an idea of how perhaps to focus my time. Maybe I begin my response with something that recently happened in Belize. Just over a week ago, a young man was left in the back of a police van negligently for 14 hours. and the police had put him there, and for some reason he was left there in the sun in this sort of van and died from a heat stroke. It caused great national concern. Tragic indeed, but apart from the tragic nature of it, when the Minister of Police and the Commissioner of Police spoke about it and were being asked in terms of the causes, both of them, and I think some might have missed it, but both of them pointed to the fact that, especially under the past government was their allegation, the police recruitment process was tainted by the hiring of people who were not trained or did not meet the qualifications, education and otherwise, and that there was basically blatant job patronage in the hiring of police. And they both pinpointed this as one of the things that we see now being reflected in the quality of the police we have. Now, clearly, this sort of thing happened not only under the past government, but I think under all political parties. I touch on this aspect of job patronage in the book. But it's a more recent reflection that, while it might seem quaint, and we talk about it sometimes over drinks in hushed tones, the key message, I think, that comes from that is that we have to ask ourselves what damage the deep entrenchment of clientelism in our small societies is doing to our body politic, our society, our political culture. And to the extent that in this particular case, job patronage played some role, giving jobs to people based upon the promise you made to them or that something they will get for political support is one of the things that is a reflection of, I think, all of our societies. And so I think going to what I think I would say is the main message of my book is that this deep entrenchment of political clientelism, handout politics, benefits politics, as we call it in some countries in the region, has reached a critical point of saturation in our societies where we need to be raising alarm bells. And so I think that part of my reason for writing the book was not to prove that this thing exists. It happens in every country in the world. It happens in all over the Caribbean. Although some of this was necessary to set the stage. But my key motivation for writing it was to try to show in the best way I could that this is having damaging consequences for our society, our democracy, our development. And I spend most of the ink, I think, in the book, in that sixth chapter, looking at the damaging consequences, and Cynthia did a very good job of, I think, summarizing them. And one of them that Godfrey mentioned, and I know Godfrey, I've never been a politician, but I did have good access, and I might come back to that in a while. But one of them that Godfrey mentioned that I think is perhaps most damaging is the politician basically replacing much of the state's formal social welfare functions with this informal side-by-side, sometimes overlapping informal system of social welfare, where because so many of the social institutions were inadequate in the first place or have broken down, and the politician then becomes the first go-to person for many people who have a need or want. And clearly, this is going to be difficult to break, but I will come back to that. But linked to this, I think, is the whole issue of the overlying and historical inabilities in our societies to deal with the social and economic needs of our societies in ways that are merit-based and in ways that are transparent and in ways that deal with the challenges and the problems in a long-term way. And in a sense, the more that this becomes the case, as I make the point in the case study in Belize, that politicians become the de facto social welfare agents for so many, the more difficult it is to change because it becomes normalized and part of political culture. Another point I want to make, and I don't think this was touched on before, is that while a lot of analyses of political clientelism would see only or mostly poor people, poorer Belizeans, poorer Caribbean people participating, that's not the case. The middle class also participates more and more. And whereas for the poor people who really have a real need or want that they cannot get directly perhaps from the formal system, in terms of middle class people, when I asked them why they would do this, it was, well, the playing field isn't level. Everyone else is doing it. If I don't do it, then I'm going to be getting the short end of the stick. I won't get ahead. And then we go to the issue of like where we are now in Belize and what can be done to mitigate this entrenched political clientelism. Where we are now is what I referred to in the book, and I don't know, I think it's a new concept. I call it, we are in a state of mutual clientelist dependency between the politician and the citizen. Where in the past, it used to be that there was a top-down sort of approach where the politicians used the basically influencing of voters by resources, favors, money, etc., in a top-down way. And but eventually, over time, as rationally, voters began to figure out how this thing worked. The demand also came from below in a bigger way. And as people learned to play the game and more people felt entitled to resources in the informal system, there's this now mutual dependency between politicians and the clients. And again, we're not talking about the whole population. My estimate was, in the case of Belize, 20 to 25%. But when we reach this level of mutual clientelist dependency, where both citizens and politicians feel that they have to play this game because this is the way it is, breaking it is exceedingly difficult, and it is a symptom that something needs to be done to break this. As Godfrey said, it's going to be a hell of a thing to break. For the political parties, they basically are in what I describe in the book as in a clientelist Cold War, because neither side will disarm their clientelist machines first. And then on the side of citizens, they will not stop going to politicians unless there are other means for them to get their needs and wants met that would be better alternatives than what the politicians offer. So it's a hell of a situation and a scenario that we find ourselves in. But to get to the final part of perhaps my quick reaction to the observations made, I do think that at the end of the book, I have a realistic assessment of where we are. It's going to be difficult to break this thing, but I wouldn't call it a pessimistic assessment. Clearly, the solutions will have to be dealing with the issues of entrenched poverty that has increased in Belize since independence dramatically, and also inequality. But that cannot be done immediately. As one politician put it, while the grass to grow, the heart to starve. And people will still have great need and want along the way. But that is not to say that there shouldn't be efforts made, and this is one of my strong recommendations to begin to improve the social welfare safety net systems that we have. And there were, as I said in the epilogue of my book, some interesting posts or during COVID responses where, for example, the unemployment assistance program, for some time, both parties came together and put together this system that worked better than most in the past. But the fact that it had to be put together from scratch, there was nothing there to build on. And the fact that the other programs were tainted by fears and accusations of political clientelism is another way to look at the fact that we really need to deal with how we do social welfare in our societies better. I think, and this is perhaps where my governance advocacy side will be coming in, that because competitive political parties will continue. I mean, they're not going to go away. And because they will always be looking for advantages in electoral strategies, including clientelism, there has to be legislative and regulatory approaches to the problem. And in Belize, for example, there's no such thing as campaign finance regulation or regulation of political parties in any way. There are things I think that could be done in that direction. The making the social welfare institutions that are co-opted by politicians more immune from that using legislation could be another thing that can be done. And in the wider constitutional reform processes, I know that in Barbados, one is on the way. Jamaica has announced that something is coming. In Belize, there's going to be a comprehensive constitutional reform process that is to be launched very soon. That there may be things that could be done constitutionally to begin to look at how, for example, to have ministers and representatives who were elected to be parliamentarians, to be legislatures, be more so than they are social welfare agents. And there's nothing in our constitutions that say that a politician has to be, as Godfrey did and other politicians did, be out at that clinic providing people with money for their electricity bill, for a bus, for food, etc., directly, and then getting personal benefit for it. There has to be some way we can deal with that issue through some legislation and regulation. So I think I will leave it there, except to end with, in my first response here, with the fact that I found it surprising, the openness that politicians spoke to me. And I was trying to ask why, and Godfrey mentioned it had to do with my, I suppose at the time at least, independent political capital I had generated in society. But also I think that nobody ever goes to politicians really and asks them seriously, so what do you think about this? Politicians are expert at elective politics and informal politics, but few people ever sit down and ask them about it. And I found that they wanted to talk about it. And one of the things that came out of that, and I call it one of the paradoxes of clientelism, is that almost all of them said to me, we find this thing distasteful. We don't want to do it. But there's nothing that we can do about it because that's the way it works. Godfrey mentioned perhaps that behavior can change. It won't change, I think, without it being forced, either by legislation or by people organized to push it. But the fact that also in talking to people, most people I spoke to, citizens, found it distasteful and would prefer not to have to do it. And so if there's this distaste about it on both the politician side, the citizen side, perhaps there's something there. And Godfrey mentioned the fact that even when politicians expend hundreds of thousands of dollars in resources and time to influence voters, they can still lose an election. Is that one of the other paradoxes of clientelism, where at some point there are diminishing returns, and these diminishing returns usually, or because of political corruption, you are not able to service as well as you used to, and the other side is doing it better. You used to give, one broker was telling me the story of, or the analogy that if one side gives chicken for some time, but the other side gives shrimp, then you have to give shrimp too. And it's a snowballing effect. And but perhaps there is some truth to the fact that, yeah, there is some diminishing returns coming from political clientelism that might have some seeds of hope. But at the end of the day, as I end the book, the pressure will have to be put, if we want to change this, on the politicians who will not unilaterally disarm their machines. They would have to come from a critical mass of people, organized, who are concerned about it. And at this point in time, that does not exist in Belize, but that is not to say it cannot exist at all. So I will end there, and again, I thank Cynthia and Godfrey for their insightful observations and positive review of the book.
Thank you, Dylan. This book has been, for me as well, an eye-opener. As you know, when one speaks about clientelism and patronage, you know, the first country you think of is Jamaica. So not to share, not that I'm happy that we're sharing inefficiencies, but it has been important to my deeper understanding of the issues that face other countries in the region, and perhaps knowing the existence of these practices elsewhere will help us all come up with solutions to them, whether it's through diminishing returns from this mutual clientelistic dependency, whether it's through legislative or constitutional reform. It is good that we are having a conversation on this issue. I would like to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. We already have two, so I will, Dylan, I'll let you know both of them at first. We have just a few minutes left before we wrap up, so I'll make it quick. So, first question is, when there's no real political difference between the parties, how do you choose to vote for, who to vote for? Can it be that this lack of difference opens the way for bribery? And another question is, what should future research focus on, and how structured? Community-targeted vote buying as a growing trend? Experimental or mixed methods research questions? So one has to do with homogeneous political parties in the race, and how does one choose, and perhaps we are viewing clientelism as a differentiating mechanism. And secondly, what's the path for research on this area?
So thanks for those questions. I'll try to be very brief to get to others. But the first question on the lack of difference between political parties. In fact, in the book, I do show that trend in the context of Belize, where the parties become more and more similar, especially when they're in power on their policy differences or policy positions. And in Belize, the term PUDP has been coined. Basically, what that says is, yeah, there's no real difference here. And so to answer the question, a lot of people, I think, and I'm saying about a quarter of the population or the electorate in Belize, makes decisions on who they would vote for in an election by which party is the better clientelist party, which is providing more to me. And so what differentiates the parties would be who is better at it in a sense over time. And that changes depending on monies and all that. I mean, clearly there are other differences that the parties will point out. But in that case, yeah, citizens get frustrated because more and more as time goes on, people catch on that this is happening. And I think that ideally what one would want is for real alternative political parties and movements to emerge that do have a difference to show in terms of their positions, ideologies, etc. On the question of future research, there are so many things that I point out in the book that that could be done, and one of them is in the COVID response, where the existing safety nets, social safety nets, were proven to be so inadequate. There was a change of a bit, mostly pushed by international organizations to have more transparency in the delivery of, say, unemployment assistance or food. And for a time, there was records kept. And I think going back and looking at those records would be important. But quickly after that, it went back to the norm. And the only thing that seemed to have been then the determining factor as to why it was so transparent as to who got what was because of the international organization funding and their requirements. But if it can be done for the international organizations, a good question is, can these same things be done for our own public money that we pay as taxpayers in a better way, including also the Constituency Development Fund? But yeah, there are quite a few other areas of research, and I see that the questioner is pinpointing perhaps community-based voting issues, but I do mention quite a few of them in my book, Lisa.
Indeed, you do, Dylan, and I encourage everyone who does not already have a copy of Political Clientelism and Democracy in Belize, From My Hand to Yours by Dr. Dylan Vernon, to get one. This book will definitely be on the reading list for a number of university courses. Beyond that, especially since Godfrey shared with us that this is not your typical dry academic work. We encourage those of you even outside of academia to get your copy of this important work. I hope Dylan will continue conversations with other audiences about his work because it is indeed very interesting and important for us to interrogate these issues. So, yeah?
Lisa, if I may, as we have this, we're coming to an end, but this short break here, the book is available in Belize, on which the case study is about at the University of the West Indies Open Campus. And I know there's some Belizeans online or live streaming. And while the book sold out a couple of weeks ago, more books are arriving this coming week, I understand. So if you don't want to do the online thing, UA Open Campus in Belize on Princess Margaret Drive has the book.
Thank you, Dylan. And I will hope that UA Press in Kingston will also make copies available. So please stay in touch with the UA Press social media, with their office, to find out how to get a copy of this book. So I'd like to thank all our viewers on YouTube for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to our two reviewers, Godfrey and Cynthia, for your different perspectives on this work that really helped to give us a comprehensive picture of Dylan's book. And thank you, Dylan, for doing this research. And finally, thank you to the board and staff of the University Press for your commitment to showcasing work from the Caribbean on the Caribbean. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you all.
My pleasure, my pleasure.